yourself for invasion. This is Indie Invasion.
Welcome to Twisted Tales. Tales set in the world of Twisted, a steampunk skirmish game by Demented Games. This is Eric here from Indie Invasion, and today's tale, The Taking, written by Peter Overton and read by our very own Mac.
The Taking. Bess sat quietly in her bedroom window, watching the street below. She idly plucked the stray leaves from a bunch of flowers. They were always worth a few coppers more if the stems were tidy. She liked to sit in the window. For one thing, the air was fresher, especially later at night, when the cacophony of merchants and the clanking of those infernal steam coaches had died down. Secondly, it made her privy to the entertainment provided by the constant stream of punters and harlots leaving the Grey Goose Tavern nearby. Down the street, Bess could see Samuel Munn lurking in a darkened alley. Sam was known locally as Sam the Slasher, an evil-tempered, vicious scoundrel, if ever there was one. Sam's latest routine was to wait for a nicely sozzled gentleman to leave the goose, and then dart out to drag his victim back into the shadows, taking his measure off the toff's purse at knife point. Were there to be resistance, then, at best, the toff could expect to leave with a jagged scar to remind him not to mess with Sam the Slasher. But in all likelihood, the fellow would never be seen again, and Sam would be sporting a new, expensive-looking coat. Tonight, Sam seemed even more furtive than usual. Bess had seen several of those strange wee lads that served Bill skulking about earlier. That usually meant one of Bill's unsettling visits was imminent, or perhaps the Dodger was making a trip to the surface. Bess liked Dodger. He always smiled and waved, and on occasion would toss her a coin from his latest filch. Bess glanced back along the darkening street towards the tavern, and noticed a well-dressed gentleman alighting clumsily from an ostentatious steam carriage, paying the driver with coins groggily fumbled from a bulging purse. She glanced back to the alleyway and saw Sam moving furtively into position. This is about to get dicey, she thought. Medusa floated gently down the murky alley, making sure she kept to the darkest shadows. She had sent out both her seeker snakes to find a new host. The last one had just fallen foul of that accursed steam carriage. Medusa was still surprised at the speed those hulking, cacophonous transports could reach. Something in Medusa's mind insisted she find a host and get to the Grey Goose. She wasn't sure why, but she knew it had to happen soon. A seeker returned, slithering fluidly along the cobblestones and nestling itself back into the portal from whence it came. Medusa's metallic, hood-like body settled to the ground as the information from the seeker assimilated. There was a potential host nearby. Medusa reactivated and drifted silently down the alley. The new hosts were always twitchy to begin with, until she had fully subdued their will. It was much easier to assume control when the host didn't expect you. That first moment of surprise left a weak mind open for easy assault. The seeker was right. Lurking in the shadows just around a corner, there stood a tall, malicious-looking man in an ill-fitting coat. He stared intently at the street beyond, careful not to be seen as he kept watch on a well-dressed man disembarking drunkenly from one of those damnable carriages. Bess looked on as the gentleman staggered away from the carriage. With a hiss and a cloud of acrid steam, the driver moved off, leaving the toff to his fumbling attempts at refastening his purse. With morbid fascination, Bess watched Sam burst from his hiding spot like a trapdoor spider and take the man around the throat, pulling him roughly back into the shadows. The street was deathly quiet, and she could just make out the startled cry of shock as Sam produced Gertie, his favorite blade, from beneath his heavy overcoat. "Give us your cash," she heard him hiss savagely, "lest Gertie here takes a drink of your guts." "You shall have no such thing," the gentleman slurred back in defiance, wobbling unsteadily as he drew himself up, puffed out his chest, and raised his fists in what could only be described as a parody of a true boxer's stance. There was a brief flurry of action, and within moments, the toff was lying flat with his back against the cobbles, clutching his stomach and moaning as Sam stood astride him, brandishing a bloodied blade in his rough hand. "Now I'll have your cash and them posh boots." Sam glowered triumphantly at the feebly twitching man. Medusa accelerated. Now, whilst the potential host was distracted, was her best chance. She cannoned into the man's broad back, throwing him sharply into the wall. His head hit the brickwork with a crack, and his knees buckled slightly. Medusa raised herself up and dropped squarely over the man's head, her cowl-shaped body settling down around his skull. Her feeder lines drove into his neck and spine, causing him to cry out as her claws encircled his neck and torso, locking her into position. She could immediately discern his panicked mind as it desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. "This one will be simple," she thought to herself as she brushed aside any resistance from his feeble self-consciousness. He wasn't clever, and for all his aggression and violence, his will was surprisingly weak. Within moments, Medusa had complete control. Bess heard strange noises coming from the alley, and straining her eyes to peer into the murk, could just make out something very odd happening. In just a few short moments, Samuel had gone from having the gentleman at his mercy, of which there was very little, it had to be said, to abruptly tumbling into the shadows as though struck by a prizefighter. Then, all at once, right from where Sam had fallen, a woman arose, clad in strange yet beautiful clothes. How very curious, even for this town, Bess thought, peering ever harder into the gloom. Having taken possession of the man's body, Medusa resumed her accustomed appearance. Under her brass cowl, the brutish form of Samuel Munn had become an elegant, sinuous woman, clad in flowing silks. Medusa glanced down at the wounded gentleman who was weakly holding up a bloodied hand, appealing for help. She knew that he was grievously injured. The large wound in his abdomen bled freely onto the cobblestones. Reaching into her cowl, she drew forth a small vial that glowed eerily with aqua light. A simple twist opened the lid with a pop, and Medusa inhaled the thick, slightly salty fumes that arose. Reaching down and cradling the man's head, she blew the essence into his mouth while softly whispering a phrase or two of alchemantic invocation. Immediately, the man's bleeding was staunched, and his wound rapidly began to close, the flesh knitting together under Medusa's intense gaze. He'd be unconscious for a little while, but he would survive. Glancing up, Medusa met the eye of an old woman watching her from a high window across the street. Bess stared. She'd never seen the like of it before. Staring in these parts often led to trouble, but try as she might, she could not take her eyes from the surreal scene unfolding below. The top half of the strange woman's face was sheathed in bronze, punctuated by glowing lenses where her eyes should be. Slim, snake-like tendrils waved gently in an elegant, hypnotic dance from the sides of her great, intricately decorated hood. Realizing she'd been spotted, Bess tried to duck out of sight, but she was too late. The woman raised her hand. There was a sudden flash of light, and before she knew what was happening, Bess found herself lying on the wooden floorboards of her room. In a daze, she raised herself to her knees and began picking up the fallen flowers that had scattered across the floor. "Best be more careful, you old duffer," she thought dreamily, straightening her chair and resuming her usual seat by the window. She looked out into the street, where all seemed quiet. Funny, she thought. I've not seen Sam tonight. Friday is always one of his nights. With an absent-minded shrug, Bess went back to arranging her posies for tomorrow. Medusa stepped quickly along the cobblestones towards the gray goose. She had made sure the woman from the window would remember nothing. Medusa was not ready to reveal herself just yet. That was not what the engine wanted. Of a sudden, there came a great explosion from the direction of the inn, followed by screams and shouts. Looking up, Medusa could see smoke billowing into the sky. That will be Lancelot, she thought, smiling quietly to herself as she picked up her pace.
Thanks, guys, for listening to today's tales. You can find our Indie Invasion podcast on all podcast platforms, including Podbean, Google, and iTunes. And please visit us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and if you can, support us on Patreon/Indie Invasion. And feel free to email us with any questions or comments at indieinvasion@gmail.com. And remember, guys, don't forget to prepare yourself for the invasion.